Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to part 2 of 3 strategies on how to lead productive meetings. I was so excited with the first ones that I said, oh my gosh, I got to give more because there's so much more. And yet, as you may or may not know, the rule of 3 is really important. And we get that from journalism. It's so important to think about things in threes. And that's usually the most that people's brains can take in. So here I am to give you 3 more tips to lead productive meetings. First of all, we've all been to that meeting where you say, okay, who wants to speak? And nobody does. And if you've been listening to my podcast, you know that my number one tip when you are not leading a meeting and somebody asks that question, or even if you're leading a meeting, but somebody asks that question, that you speak first, because that's going to show leadership and it will also get your voice out there. But what I want to focus on today is these 3 things. One being first, when you're leading a meeting, make sure that you are asking open-ended questions. Too often what happens is we ask closed-ended questions where it's a yes or a no answer, or as opposed to, so do you think we should do this or do this? Now, that's sort of a gray area, honestly, because there would be typically more expansion in the answer for each of those things. But in general, think about questions like, what does everybody think about that? Tell me more, even though technically that's not a question, but the point here is to probe, to go deeper. And a lot of times we'll ask a question and then we'll stop and think, oh, well, that's good enough. Now, there are going to be times, let's just be really clear here, where you might want or need to ask a closed-ended question like a yes or no, because sometimes for the sake of time, you don't have time to expand and explore and discover. We have to know when is it appropriate to ask a closed-ended question. But generally speaking, asking an open-ended question is going to give you the most meat as far as an answer goes. It also shows that you assume that people are going to have an idea or have a thought. As opposed, so in other words, don't say, excuse me, does anybody have a thought about that? Or does anybody have an idea? Instead, say something like, what ideas do you have? What thoughts do you have? And that is going to create a much more open dialogue. And as we're talking about this, it's making me think about the fact that there are always 2 conversations that we're having at work. One is conversations for discovery, and one is conversations for action. And when you think about it, conversations for discovery are truly that. There's brainstorming. Usually they take more time. Usually you have more time in general allotted for them. They are meetings where the point is simply to get ideas, create more innovation, and leave time for that creative process as well. Giving time and space for those ideas to come more organically and more naturally, certainly with some probing questions to help the team get there. Now, that's conversations for discovery. There are conversations for action when you are truly getting together and saying, we need to make a decision and we need to make it today, or we need to make it this week, or whatever it is. But it is moving towards something specific that there's an action step to, or a plan, or perhaps a strategy. So it's really important to make sure that you and the people in the meeting are all on the same page, which is why one of the strategies from last time was about setting expectations, making sure that you have an agenda in advance and that you're really clear about what the intent of that meeting is. Now, let's move on. So that was open-ended, asking open-ended questions. That is one of the strategies. And again, I've got 3 strategies here total. And if you'd like to go back and hear part 1 of this, please do. That is a different podcast episode. So for now, number 2 is to stay focused. As I always tell people, I am a recovering rambler myself. It is very easy to ramble, get off topic, and yet we need to stay focused if we're going to run productive meetings. Now, I will say this. I had a really interesting dialogue with somebody that I met
through another colleague, both business people, and we were talking about the difference between a tangent and rambling. And are they actually different? And it was pretty interesting because she said, well, because I will tell you, I honestly initially was thinking that they were pretty much the same thing. But she was telling me about one of the leaders that she deeply respects who goes off on tangents a fair amount of time. But she said they're always relevant tangents. So here's what I would say to that. Always make sure if you are going off on a tangent or you allow someone else to continue on the track of a tangent, make sure it's intentional. That's the key difference. If it's intentional, and you could even say, okay, so it looks like we've got a really great arm to this or branch to this topic, or a whole other conversation is coming out of this and it's really juicy or it's really good, whatever you would say that's appropriate in that environment. You could say, does it seem like an appropriate tangent to get on? Here's what we will put off on the agenda if we go and have that. So it's simply stopping, being that voice of reason to say, does this make sense? Do we want to keep on this tangent or this trajectory, however you want to say it? Tangent has a negative connotation to it, so you may want to say something. You probably don't want to say, hey, you're on a tangent, but something like, does it make sense to continue on this path? So the thing to keep in mind is to be in charge. And we talked about that as the tip before, but that was more focused on your voice. And are you speaking with conviction? Do people feel like you are credible and you are taking them somewhere as a leader? Because unfortunately, if we don't feel that way about the person leading the meeting, most of us will either tune out or will tend to either help or try to potentially even take over. And I don't know about you, but I do not want anybody doing that with me. So the key here with staying focused is specifically in this tip or strategy is specifically related to having a point and staying to it. So from a content perspective, this is what I mean here. Stay focused, stay on point. And if you are going to go off point or off tangent, or I mean on a tangent, or you tend to ramble, well, we'll talk about rambling in a minute. Let's get back to the tangent. Make sure that you're intentional about it. And then the rambling component is simply when you notice that you are rambling, you're going off on a rabbit trail, or you're talking in circles, which happens to the best of us. The key is to stop, pause, and say out loud. And my point is this. The time in which you stop and pause gives you enough time to think about what your point is, get back to it, and state that out loud. That will also not only help keep you focused, but it'll keep your audience focused. So that is definitely a key component to making sure that you stay on track. That's number 2. Number 3 is to end with action items. We've all been there. I'm amazed at the amount of meetings that just end and you're rushing to the next one and you wonder what just happened at that meeting. We've got to make sure that we are doing a recap at the end and making sure that the action is clear. So if you're going to have a meeting, make sure that it has a point and there's a reason. If it has a point, there's going to be some type of action at the end, even if it's a brainstorming meeting. At the end, you'll say something like, okay, here's what we've agreed to. Here are the next steps for this. And you move forward with some type of plan. So the key with the action at the end is to make sure that it is time dated or time stamped, however you want to put it. Basically, have a deadline to the action items that you want to put together. And I would be collaborative. You don't want to just make decisions for people. I don't know that people would do that anyway, especially the people that are in my audience, but making sure that you are clarifying, okay, here's what I heard in the meeting. John, my understanding is this is what your plan is. Sue, here's what you're doing. Did I get that right? So it's not just that you're dictating, you're actually reclarifying, asking the question, and then checking for understanding so that then you can move that forward. And the recap is very related to the action items. It's just simply, okay, let's do a quick recap of the meeting. Here's where we started. Here's where we landed. John, Sue, Joan, whoever, you're going to do this. That's my understanding. Here's what I'll do. And then you move on. Now, when I say move on, I mean stop the meeting and go do your own thing. Go about your business, go about your job. But I also want to say that it is a really good idea when you have the time and you got to decide if the payoff is worth it to you or not. I would say sometimes it's really important, especially when you have a big project that you're working on. But that is to send a follow up recap. So the follow up would include, here's what we discussed, here are the action items. Thanks everybody for being there and your attention. Here's what I'm doing, blah, 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 blah. So that's all that all gets out there and you're able to document it. And I will tell you, there is something really powerful about documenting the things that happened. And I'll tell you a sad story, but it was a powerful one for me. This was many years ago at my first managerial role, and I was working in the corporate office at Gap Inc. And Gap Inc. is at that time, well, I think it still is, but the main family of brands was Banana Republic, Old Navy, and Gap. And I remember a very important lesson that I learned, and that is to document things. In this case, well, we all have bosses that work at a company, I guess, unless we're the owner, but we all answer to somebody, whether it's our clients or whomever. But in this case, I was doing well. I was tracking well with my job. And about a year in, I got a new manager. And every time I would meet with him, he would either be on his phone and I'd have to sit there and wait for him to be done, or he would interrupt when I was talking. He would take calls and that kind of thing. Not to mention, the most important thing to say here related to our topic today is that after we would agree on things, then he would go back after I'd go about my day, and then he would act as if we hadn't talked about something, or he just expected me, like basically punished me for not doing the thing that he thought I was supposed to do, but that isn't even what we agreed to. So, all of this to say, what I realized that I had to do for myself is to document those conversations. I'm not saying, now this is so atypical. I hope this isn't a situation that has happened to you or will happen to you, but it taught me the powerful lesson of making sure that everybody's clear. So, after the meetings, I would actually email him and I would say, because I took it upon myself, I knew he wasn't going to do it. I wrote him and said, here are the things we agreed to. That was my understanding. If there's anything different that you think we should be doing or I should be doing, please let me know. But this is my action plan for the week. And I'll tell you, that was the smartest thing that I ever did. Sadly, or not sadly, this guy got, a year later, he was escorted off the premises due to a security breach. But I digress. I simply want to remind you, in general, it's really good practice to document anything. And my HR folks in the house definitely know the power of this. And that the more you can do that, the better you'll be, not just for yourself, but it's a great communication tool. So sometimes, let's face it, you might just forget what happened at the meeting, and maybe life happens and nobody did their action items. And then you go, hey, whatever happened to that meeting we did 2 weeks ago? You can go back to the meeting notes or the recap and say, oh yeah, that's right, I was supposed to do this, and client challenges or what have you got in the way, so I didn't do it. So those are the things that I would recommend as 3 more strategies to lead productive meetings. And again, let's recap here. The first one is to ask open-ended questions. Number 2, stay focused in your content so you stay on point. And number 3, end with action so that you all know what you're doing and by when. So those are my tips. I might likely have more for you. And if you want more tips like this, please consider me as a speaker for your next event. I would absolutely love to talk with you more about the topics that I provide, but most of the time it's about confident communication, because that is what I'm all about. And that is so important to be practical and make sure that everybody has the tools. You are all equipped. That's what I want. I want you to be equipped so you can move forward in your life as confidently as possible. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.